On the night of July 3rd, 1979, 14 hours before fireworks were supposed to crack open the humid Louisiana sky, 18 fishermen vanished somewhere between Bayou Lacombe and the marsh channels that fed into Lake Pontchartrain. Their skiffs were found drifting at dawn, motors idling, nets half pulled, bait buckets overturned, but not a single man aboard. Some boats had deep gouges along their hulls as if they'd scraped violently against cypress roots. Others looked untouched, eerily pristine. For the next 3 days, the marsh stayed silent. No gulls circling, no ripples of gators hunting, no voices echoing across the water. Locals said the bayou had gone still in mourning. On July 7th, the bodies began to surface. All 18 men were found in a 4 square mile radius, caught in submerged roots or tangled in Spanish moss that hung low over the black water. Their hands were bound, their mouths packed with mud. Many had been weighted with cast-iron trot-line anchors that investigators traced back to a single remote shack outside St. Tammany Parish. The shack belonged to the Dupree family. The Louisiana State Police would later call it the most coordinated mass drowning in state history. The FBI, who entered the case under suspicion of interstate kidnapping, wrote something colder in their report. This was not a killing spree. This was an act of old bayou justice, planned and executed with precision. But what could drive a family, 1 father and 4 sons, to eliminate 18 grown men across 2 nights of hunting on the water? Not drugs, not territory, not money, not moonshine, gambling, or bootlegging. It was a missing wooden bait box, a box worth maybe $3, but priceless to the man who carved it by hand when he was 12 years old. A box the Dupree family claimed had been stolen, a box that, according to them, was the last thing Daddy had from the old world. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events, and the motives behind it may be more disturbing than the acts themselves. The bayou wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing thing, slow, ancient, and temperamental. Cypress trees rose out of the black water like twisted cathedral pillars. Spanish moss hung in sheets from branches high as gallows. Mosquito foggers rolled through every porch in St. Tammany Parish each night. But the insects always won. Daytime temperatures hit 92 degrees, humidity hovering near 100%. At night, the air turned thick as soup. You could feel it sticking to your skin like a second layer. The sounds were constant and layered. The drone of cicadas, the croaking of bullfrogs, the distant hum of shrimp boats, and the low, monotonous churn of the water moving through marsh veins, carved centuries earlier. Bayou communities followed their own rules. Outsiders weren't entirely unwelcome, but they weren't trusted either. People fixed their own roofs, caught their own supper, and settled their own disputes. The sheriff's office in Lacombe had 4 deputies covering nearly 300 square miles of marshland. If someone needed help, it was usually their neighbors who arrived first. And no neighbor was more known or more feared than the Dupree clan. 4 miles off the nearest dirt road, connected only by a web of shallow channels, the Dupree family lived on a narrow rise of land the locals called Saints Island. No saints had ever lived there. Their home was a long, sagging shotgun house built in the 1930s, propped up on cypress stilts, driven deep into the muck. Behind it sat a shed full of rusted traps, trot lines, and outboard parts. Out front, a rickety dock stretched 20 feet into the dark water, just wide enough for 2 skiffs to tie up. The land smelled like motor oil, mud, and smoked catfish, smoke that drifted across the bayou so thick that people 2 miles away could tell when the Duprees were cooking. They were not wealthy, but they were not poor either. They lived in that middle ground, unique to the Louisiana wilderness, self-reliant, suspicious, territorial, and proud. Their closest neighbors were alligators, and the marsh, in return for their respect, had kept them hidden and safe for decades. At the head of the clan stood Elias Eli Dupree, 58 years old in 1979. He was 6'3", gaunt but powerful, with hands warped from decades of rope burns and gator wrestling. His beard grew in wild streaks of gray, a long scar cut from the corner of his lip to the bottom of his jaw. A gift, he claimed, from a bull gator he'd killed with nothing but a bait hook and pure spite. Eli Dupree lived by a code older than Louisiana itself. A man takes care of what's his. A man protects what's his. A man answers disrespect. He had 4 sons. Silas Dupree, 32, the enforcer, broad-shouldered, silent, rarely seen without a hunting knife at his belt. People said he could hold a man underwater longer than any sane person should. Caleb Dupree, 29, the navigator, knew every channel, root system, and dead end of the bayou like he had a map tattooed behind his eyes. Jonah Dupree, 24, the marksman, could shoot a cottonmouth out of a cypress branch from 80 yards, never raised his voice, never smiled. Levi Dupree, 21, the shadow, the youngest, still half boy, half man, too eager to prove himself in a family where proving yourself usually meant someone else didn't make it home. The Dupree men trapped gators, harvested crawfish, guided tourists through the shallows, repaired boats, and occasionally, if rumors were true, did enforcement work for people who preferred not to involve the law. But there was one thing the family cared about more than their work, more than their land, more than the bayou itself: Eli's bait box. Eli Dupree carved it in 1933 when he was 12 years old, a simple cedar box, no bigger than a lunch pail, with a hand-whittled sliding lid. His father had taught him how to carve, and the box was the only thing Eli had left from him after the man drowned in the Pearl River 2 years later. Eli kept the box on his skiff every day for 45 years. It held his hooks, weights, and lucky river stones. Locals joked it was Eli's second heart, and they weren't wrong. On June 28, 1979, the box disappeared. Eli found the lid floating near his dock, waterlogged and cracked. The box itself was gone. He didn't report it. He didn't ask the sheriff. He didn't talk to tourists or to the parish office. Instead, he gathered his 4 sons on their dock at sunset. Witnesses on passing boats later said the Dupree men stood side by side staring into the water like they were reading a message only they could see. One fisherman swore he heard Eli say, "If they want what's mine, then let the bayou take what's theirs." 5 days later, 18 men would be dead. Eli Dupree's childhood was carved into the mud and shadows of the Louisiana Bayou. Most people in St. Tammany Parish lived on land, but the Duprees were born of the water. When Eli was only 9, his father took him into the cypress groves at dawn and taught him how to read the surface of the swamp the way other children read school books. He learned the difference between the ripple of a gator pushing forward and the lazy drift of a turtle coming up for air. By 11, he was setting his own traps. By 12, he was running night trot lines alongside his father, memorizing every bend and every whisper the water made. His father's death carved a permanent wound through him. The man drowned in the Pearl River, his body found 3 days later tangled in branches so tight the rescuers had to cut him free. The only thing Eli kept after that day was a small cedar bait box he carved with his own hands. It became the last piece of his father he had left, and it followed him everywhere for the next 45 years. He never went on to the water without it. Silas, the oldest of the Dupree brothers, grew up under the weight of expectation. By the time he was 32, people said he had become a mirror of Eli. Silent, disciplined, and dangerous when necessary. Silas moved through the swamp like he was carved from it. He could sense disturbances in the water before they were visible, knew when something was approaching from the subtle shift in air pressure, and could stand so still that even the mosquitoes hesitated to bite. He did not argue, did not question, and did not hesitate. What needed to be done was done. If Eli was the mind of the family, Silas was the hands, unshakable, precise, and merciless when pushed. Caleb was different. While his brothers learned to wrestle gators or repair engines, Caleb drew maps. As a child, he etched the twisting canals, dead ends, and hidden shortcuts of the bayou into scraps of paper. He grew to know the swamp's geography better than any surveyor. Locals said he had the marsh written behind his eyes. If a boat got lost at night, and many did, it was Caleb who could predict exactly where the current would drag it, at what point the roots would snag the hull or which unseen channel a fleeing man might take. His knowledge made him essential to the quiet influence the Dupree family held. And when people later learned that Caleb had been involved in the 1979 drownings, they said the same thing. If Caleb guided the hunt, no one could have escaped. Jonah, the 3rd son, was the quietest. He did not speak unless necessary. He did not celebrate, did not brag, and did not show anger. But he had a gift that made even seasoned hunters uneasy: absolute precision. At 16, with an old .22 rifle his father handed him, he shot a water snake clean through the eye from 60 feet. After that, Jonah became the eyes of the family. He could spot movement through branches so thick they looked like curtains. He could track a target by reflections alone. If Jonah saw you, you were already marked. He didn't enjoy violence. He didn't avoid it either. He was calm in a way that frightened people who knew what calm could mean in the bayou. Levi, the youngest, lived in the shadow of all of them. Still half boy at 21, he carried a restless energy that made him both eager and unpredictable. All Levi wanted was to prove himself, prove he was worthy of the Dupree name, worthy of Eli's approval, worthy of being considered more than just the baby brother. That desperation made him bold, and boldness in the bayou was dangerous. In Levi's eyes, the family was unquestionable. If Eli said it, it was truth. If Silas acted, it was justified. If Caleb chose the path, it was the only path. And if Jonah looked at something twice, then it mattered. Loyalty made Levi valuable, but it also made him volatile. The 18 fishermen who would soon become targets had no history with the Duprees. They weren't rivals, criminals, or enemies. They were ordinary men. Blue crab catchers, catfish netters, shrimp dock workers, and part-time tour guides. They passed the Dupree territory almost daily, navigating the narrow channels that cut near Saints Island. The Duprees never spoke to them, and they never spoke to the Duprees. It was an unspoken agreement of the swamp: stay respectful, stay distant, and the bayou stays calm. But in the summer of 1979, that balance shattered. Among the 18 fishermen was one man, Henry Mouton, a quiet, unremarkable worker from Covington who rarely raised his voice and never stirred trouble. On the day Eli's bait box disappeared, Henry happened to be running a net near the Dupree dock. In any town, that coincidence would mean nothing. But the bayou did not run on evidence or logic. It ran on signs. And to Eli, the broken lid floating near Henry's net was not a coincidence. It was an insult. Henry denied taking the box. He insisted he saw nothing unusual. But it didn't matter. In the rules of the marsh, proximity was guilt, silence was admission, and disrespect demanded correction. Over the next days, people noticed a change in Eli's eyes. Silas became quieter than usual. Caleb spent hours studying the water with a strange intensity. Jonah kept watching the tree line, and Levi paced like he was waiting for some unseen signal. Locals felt it before they understood it. Something old and dangerous was waking inside the Dupree family. The air seemed heavier, the nights louder, the currents unpredictable. Some said they could feel the tension humming in the water itself. By the 6th day, Eli had already decided what must be done. The bayou, in his mind, had been violated. His father's last relic had been disrespected. And when something sacred was taken from the Duprees, the response wasn't negotiation, it wasn't conversation, it was retribution. And in the eerie stillness of the swamp, where the air clung thick to the skin and the darkness moved like a living thing, the first steps of that retribution were already unfolding, silent, patient, and deadly. The night the plan took shape, the bayou was suffocating under a wall of heat so thick it felt alive. Thunderheads rolled low over the marsh, their distant flashes illuminating the cypress silhouettes like skeletons rising from the water. Most fishermen had already headed home, tying up their skiffs along the docks in Lacombe, Slidell, and the smaller unmarked landings tucked into reed-covered channels. But a handful remained out late, pulling in final nets before the storms came. Among them was Henry Mouton, still unaware that the Duprees had already spoken his name. Eli's decision didn't come with theatrics or speeches. He gathered his sons on the back porch just as the last light bled out of the sky. The mosquitoes swarmed aggressively, but none of the men moved to swat them away. Eli simply stared into the water, the broken lid of his bait box resting on his knee. The wood, swollen from days in the murky depths, had split along one edge. He ran his thumb across the jagged line until blood surfaced, but he didn't flinch. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above the frogs in the reeds. "They took from us," he said. "We return it." That was all. Silas nodded slowly, a single heavy dip of his head. Caleb exhaled like he had been holding the air since the moment the box disappeared. Jonah looked toward the channel, searching the darkness as if he could already see the men who would soon be fighting for breath. And Levi, breath trembling, waited for someone to give him a roll. Something that would prove he wasn't the weak link in a family built on water and grit. Eli stood, took up his paddle, and started down the dock. The four brothers followed without a word. They boarded two small skiffs, quiet boats with shallow drafts that could slip through weeds and roots without drawing attention. Caleb chose the route, pointing them toward the outer canals where the first fishermen would likely still be working their lines. The bayou swallowed them almost immediately, the glow of their lanterns tucked under burlap to hide the light. The storm had not yet broken, but the pressure was building. The air tasted metallic, and every sound carried strangely far. The Duprees moved in perfect coordination, cutting the motors and drifting on the currents until the faint shapes of boats appeared ahead. 3 skiffs anchored in a narrow pass, their owners leaning over the sides pulling in catfish nets. Jonah saw them first. He tapped the wooden edge of his boat twice, a signal. Silas nodded, dipping his paddle just enough to slow their drift to a silent crawl. Henry Mouton was not with this first group, but for the Duprees, guilt had become contagious. Every man who fished their water that night now stood under the same shadow. The approach was surgical. Caleb angled the boat just behind the first skiff while Jonah watched the man aboard, an older fisherman named Paul de Roche. Paul was whistling, oblivious, the melody carried away by the rising wind. Silas climbed into the water with the ease of someone entering his own home. He moved beneath Paul's skiff, gripping the hull with long, scarred fingers. And on Caleb's signal, he surfaced behind the man and dragged him overboard before the whistle even ended. Paul's shout was cut off by a surge of water, and Silas held him under with a calm, brutal certainty. The splash was swallowed by thunder, and when Silas surfaced again, Paul was limp. The second fisherman, Remy Gautreau, heard the disturbance too late. Jonah stepped onto his skiff like a shadow, the rifle slung on his back unused. There was no need for noise. One hand pressed Remy's head into the water, while the other braced against the boat. The man kicked, splashed, and clawed at the wood, but Jonah's expression didn't change. His grip was steady, his breath collected. It was method, not emotion. The third fisherman tried to flee. He started his motor in panic, but Levi leapt into the boat before it could turn, grabbing the tiller and wrestling it sideways. The skiff spun, striking a submerged root. The man fell, hitting his head on the edge of the seat. Levi froze for a moment, stunned by the accidental blow, then looked back at Silas for guidance. Silas gave a single nod, and Levi pushed the man's head beneath the water. His hands shook. The struggle lasted longer. But when the fisherman finally stopped moving, Levi's breathing steadied. He had proven himself, in the only language the family understood. The bodies were weighted with trotline anchors, each one tied with the same knot Eli had taught his sons as boys. They sank quickly, drifting into the roots below. The Duprees pushed on. Hours later, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the water, flattening waves and disguising movement. Thunder rolled so violently it shook the skiffs. The Duprees used the chaos like a cloak. They found the next group of fishermen near the marsh edge, 4 men hauling in crab traps. These men were stronger, younger, and more aware of their surroundings. A fight broke out on the third skiff. One of the fishermen swung a gaff hook at Silas, slicing across his shoulder. But the wound only strengthened his resolve. He disarmed the man with a violent twist and dragged him overboard. Another man tried to jump into the reeds, but Caleb circled ahead, cutting off his exit and forcing him into deeper water. Jonah's rifle stayed slung across his back. His hands did not need a weapon. The drownings were not random bursts of rage. They were coordinated, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The Duprees acted without hesitation, each son an extension of Eli's will. The rain washed away every sign of the struggle, the storm dispersing the sounds before they could reach anyone else. By dawn, 9 men were dead. 9 more remained. The bayou, usually filled with bird calls and the chatter of early fishermen, was unnervingly silent. The storm clouds began to break apart, revealing strips of pale pink sky. Mist rose from the water like steam off a boiling pot. And through that mist, the Dupree skiffs glided forward, moving deeper into the marsh, toward the fishermen who had stayed out overnight to wait out the weather. Among them was Henry Mouton. He had no idea that the darkness behind him wasn't just the retreating storm. It was justice, carved in cedar, and it was coming for him. By the time the sun began to rise, the bayou had transformed into something otherworldly, its surface covered in a thin sheet of mist that drifted like ghosts across the water. The storm had passed, but its temper lingered in the air. Branches dripped with rainwater that fell in slow, rhythmic taps, and the current pushed lazily through the narrow cuts between the cypress roots. It was the kind of morning where the world looked half awake, half dreaming. But for the Dupree family, the dream had already sharpened into purpose. They drifted in silence, the skiffs gliding without motors, carried only by the gentle push of the tide. The weight of what they had already done didn't show on their faces. There was no hesitation, no regret. The killings were not finished, and in the bayou, unfinished business was the only true sin. Eli sat at the front of the lead skiff, eyes narrowed, his jaw tight. The damp air clung to his beard, making him look like something carved from the swamp itself. His fingers traced the split cedar lid in his lap, the wood darkened by rain and time. the jagged edge a constant reminder of why they were out here. Ahead they could hear voices, faint, drifting through the mist. Men talking, laughing, unaware that half their friends were lying at the bottom of the bayou, tangled in roots and weighted by cast-iron anchors. Caleb squinted, trying to separate the echoes from the real direction, then pointed toward a narrow channel that veered sharply left. That channel led to a sheltered cove where fishermen often anchored during storms. The Duprees slid into it, their boats barely making a sound. There were 4 skiffs tied together near the cove's center. Men were repairing nets, wringing out soaked clothes, and cooking breakfast over a small propane stove balanced on the edge of a boat. The smell of sausage drifted across the water. It was an ordinary scene. A group of fishermen waiting for better weather, thinking the worst part of the night was behind them. Silas leaned forward, his eyes locked on the group. Jonah rested his hand on the rifle slung across his back, though he didn't reach for the trigger. They all knew this part would be harder. These men were awake, alert, prepared. Eli whispered, "Stay in the mist." The fog did most of the work for them. The Dupree skiffs moved along the outer edge of the cove, hidden just enough to blur their shapes. The fishermen noticed movement but assumed it was debris left over from the storm. One of them, Louis Boudreau, a thick-shouldered man with a sunburned neck, stood and peered into the haze. "Anybody out there?" he called. His voice echoed, then folded into the mist. Silas answered by ramming his skiff into the side of Louis's boat, the collision so sudden it threw Louis backward. Before the others could understand what was happening, Silas vaulted over the gunwale and tackled Louis into the water. The splash was enormous, a violent break in the otherwise still morning. Caleb steered the skiff around the knot of boats, blocking any escape route. Jonah stepped onto the nearest deck with quiet precision, and Levi followed him, nerves buzzing but determination anchoring his feet. Louis resurfaced once, gasping, but Silas was already on him. He pushed Louis under, muscles taut, face expressionless. The man kicked wildly, churning up mud and bubbles, until finally the movement stopped. Silas let him sink. Jonah faced the second fisherman before the man even reached for the fillet knife on his belt. Jonah grabbed his wrist, twisted with a practiced motion, and sent the knife clattering into the water. The fisherman punched him in the jaw, a blow that would have knocked another man back. But Jonah barely blinked. He wrapped his arms around the struggling man and pulled him overboard with a clean, controlled motion. Jonah didn't fight like a man. He fought like a force of nature, inevitable and silent. Within moments, the water stilled again. Levi confronted the third man, a wiry younger fisherman named Tate, who reacted faster than the others. Tate lunged with a hook, slicing across Levi's arm. The pain lit a fire in Levi's eyes and thumb, and for a split second, he froze. Tate tried to start the motor, but the pull cord snagged. That hesitation cost him everything. Levi grabbed him from behind, yanking him backwards so hard, they both tumbled onto the deck. Tate struggled, slamming elbows into Levi's ribs, clawing at his face, cursing until his voice cracked. Levi held on with desperate strength, fueled by equal parts fear and loyalty. When he finally dragged Tate toward the edge of the skiff, Silas appeared beside him, grabbed Tate's ankles, and together they flipped him into the water. The struggle lasted longer than the others, but the end was the same. The fourth fisherman, older and slower, had tried to hide behind a stack of crab traps. Caleb approached him calmly, speaking almost gently. "You don't have to make this harder," he said. The man raised trembling hands, eyes wide with terror. "I didn't take anything," he said. "I swear, I ain't never touched your stuff." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. His face didn't show anger or pleasure, only certainty. "Doesn't matter anymore." And with that, he pushed the man into the water and held him down. When the cove finally fell silent, Jonah scanned the tree line once more. No other boats, no voices, no witnesses. They tied the bodies together with heavy rope, weighted them down, and let the bayou swallow them one by one, each disappearing beneath the surface in quiet, final ripples. Only 5 men remained. One of them was Henry Mouton. And as the mist began to burn away under the rising sun, Eli Dupree lifted the split cedar lid once more, running his thumb along the cracked wood as if it were guiding him. "Find him," he said. The bayou obeyed. The Duprees began to hunt again. By late morning, the mist had lifted enough for sunlight to cut through the trees in long, golden blades. The bayou finally looked alive again. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the water rippling with the movement of turtles and gar. To anyone passing through, it seemed like a peaceful Louisiana day, settling in after a night of storms. But beneath the surface, woven into the roots and muck, 14 bodies lay hidden, each one tied with the same knots Eli Dupree had learned as a boy. The bayou might have looked calm, but it was already carrying the weight of a massacre. The remaining fishermen had scattered during the storm, each anchoring in different pockets of the marsh. Some were already heading back toward town, hoping to beat the heat. Others lingered, assessing damage to their nets and traps. None of them knew that the Duprees were now moving with a singular focus, finding Henry Mouton. Henry had anchored in a place the locals called Devil's Mouth, a narrow stretch where cypress trees formed an arch over the water. The branches so intertwined they blocked most of the sunlight. It wasn't a popular spot. The currents there were unpredictable, and the root systems were dense enough to snare any careless boat. But Henry liked the quiet. He said it helped him think. He often told people he never understood how the bayou scared some men. Henry didn't know fear was drifting toward him with silent oars. The Duprees stopped speaking entirely. Communication became instinct. Caleb read the currents, pointing them through the tightest passages without scraping a single root. Silas and Jonah scanned the shadows. Levi sat rigid at the front of the second skiff, every muscle tight. And Eli, his hand resting on the split cedar lid, stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. They found Henry's skiff tucked against the roots, half hidden under low-hanging moss. His lines were already in the water, baited and waiting. Henry himself was seated at the back of the boat, fixing a tear in his cast net. He didn't see the Dupree skiffs at first. The sun was behind them, turning their silhouettes into moving shadows. Jonah tapped the side of the boat twice. It was the same signal he'd used hours earlier. Silas gripped his paddle and slowed the drift. Henry finally looked up. He squinted, confused, then stood. "Eli? That you?" His voice carried lightly across the water. "Storm's over now. Y'all need help?" No one answered. Henry stepped closer to his bow, shading his eyes with his hand. His face changed when he realized all 4 brothers were with their father. The bayou had rules, unspoken but known. Families didn't gather like that on the water, unless something was wrong, something serious. Henry's voice dropped. "Is everything all right?" Eli stood in his skiff, slowly raising the broken cedar lid. He held it up so Henry could see the crack running through the middle. "You recognize this?" Eli asked. Henry blinked, confused. "Is that a bait box lid?" "Didn't know it was yours." Eli's eyes sharpened. "You were fishing near my dock the day this went missing." Henry shook his head. "Eli, I swear to God I didn't take nothing. I ain't stupid enough to steal from you. Everybody knows." "You touched what was mine," Eli said. "That's enough." Henry took a step back. No, Eli, listen to me. If it floated my way, I didn't see it. Maybe someone else." Silas cut the motor behind Henry's skiff. The sudden silence was suffocating. Henry's breath quickened. "Eli, wait, please. You know me. I ain't never messed with you or your family." Jonah stepped onto Henry's boat. Henry stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bucket of bait fish. "Jonah, think about what you're doing," he pleaded. "This ain't right. This ain't justice." Jonah didn't answer. Caleb maneuvered the skiff to cut off the exit. Levi moved to the other side, blocking the deeper channel. Henry was boxed in, trapped in his own boat. "Eli," Henry said softly, "please don't do this. You got the wrong man." Eli's voice was calm, too calm. "The bayou don't make mistakes." Silas grabbed Henry's arm. Henry reacted on instinct. He swung the bait knife he'd been using to repair the net. The blade sliced across Silas's forearm, leaving a thin trail of blood. Silas barely reacted, but the cut sealed Henry's fate. Levi lunged first, grabbing Henry's wrist. Henry twisted, panicking, shouting for help that would never come. Jonah moved behind him, gripping his shoulders. Caleb stepped forward to steady the boat as it rocked violently beneath them. Henry fought like a man who finally understood the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding, a warning, or a threat. It was an execution. "Please," Henry choked out. "My family. Please, Eli." Eli stepped onto Henry's skiff, looked down at him with eyes devoid of anger or comfort. "You took something from me," Eli said quietly. "Now the water takes you." Henry screamed as all 4 brothers forced him over the side. His hands grabbed at the gunwale, trying desperately to pull himself back up. Silas peeled his fingers away, one by one. Jonah pushed his head beneath the surface. Caleb held down his legs. Levi, trembling but determined, tied the anchor rope around Henry's ankle. Henry fought until he couldn't. The water swallowed him whole, the rope tightening as the anchor dragged him into darkness. The ripples spread slowly, then faded. The bayou returned to silence. Eli stared at the water for a long time before whispering, "It's done." But it wasn't, because 4 fishermen still remained, scattered across the outer channels, men who had shared the water with Henry that night, men the Duprees now viewed as accomplices simply because they were nearby. And the Duprees did not leave things unfinished. As Eli turned his skiff back into the main channel, the brothers followed without question. The hunt wasn't over yet. The bayou had 4 more debts to claim. The sun was high by the time the Duprees steered their skiffs back into the wider channels. The storm logs, the shattered branches, the floating debris. All of it drifted lazily on the surface, making the bayou look less like a place of life and more like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. 4 men were still somewhere out there, hauling traps or repairing nets, unaware that the bayou they trusted had already turned into a graveyard. Eli stood tall in the skiff despite the heat pressing down like a weight. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat and swamp water. But he didn't seem to notice. The broken cedar lid lay across his knees, the crack now darker and swollen, as if the bayou itself had seeped into it. His eyes never lifted from the channels ahead. Each turn, each shift of current felt like part of a map only he could read. The hunt had changed him. The men he'd lost to the swamp decades ago, his father, friends, neighbors, seemed to rise with the heat, guiding his decisions. Caleb motioned with 2 fingers toward the western marsh, where grass rose knee-high above water, so still it looked solid from a distance. That was where fishermen often anchored when fatigue set in. A quiet place, a patient place, a place where no one heard you scream. They entered the tall grass like ghosts slipping through curtains. The sound dropped instantly. No insects, no frogs, no wind, only the creak of wet wood beneath their feet and the slow paddling of oars dipping into the water. Then, faintly, they heard voices. 2 men. Then another farther out. 3, not 4. Silas tightened his grip on the paddle. Jonah's eyes narrowed. Levi swallowed hard, wiping sweat from his brow. Eli whispered, "Split." The skiffs separated silently, one heading left, the other right, cutting a path around the hidden fishermen. On the left, Jonah and Levi drifted toward the first 2. The men were arguing, something about torn nets, busted traps, lost profit. Their voices bounced between the reeds, making it difficult to tell exactly where they were. Jonah raised a hand, signaling Levi to stay low. He guided the skiff until the silhouettes finally came into view. 2 fishermen, one young, one much older, facing away from them. Jonah stepped out of the skiff into waist-deep water, his feet sinking into mud so soft it nearly pulled him downward. The fishermen didn't notice. The grass swallowed the sound. Jonah moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before. He approached the skiff slowly, letting the reeds hide him until the very last second. When the older fisherman leaned over to untangle a snagged trap, Jonah's hand shot up from the water and grabbed his wrist. The man let out a startled gasp, but Jonah yanked him forward, pulling him clean off the boat. The splash was muted by the grass. Levi watched the younger fisherman whirl around, eyes wide with confusion. Before the man could process what he saw, Jonah dragging his partner under, Levi launched himself across the small gap between the boats. They collided hard, rocking the skiff dangerously. The fisherman reached for an oar, swinging wildly. The blade clipped Levi's shoulder, knocking him sideways, but Levi recovered quickly. He grabbed the oar mid-swing, pulled the man toward him, and toppled him into the water. Levi jumped in after him. The fight was brutal and clumsy. Mud, grass, and water thrashing around them. The fisherman broke free, kicking upward, reaching for the boat. Levi grabbed his ankle and pulled him back under. The man screamed bubbles into the murky depths. Jonah joined him, pressing the man down with unshakable calm until his movements stopped. Both bodies slipped beneath the reeds, swallowed by roots. 2 down. On the right side of the marsh, Eli, Silas, and Caleb stalked the third fisherman. They found him sitting on an overturned bucket, eating from a tin of beans. He looked tired, worn out from the storm. His boat was tied to a cypress root, drifting lazily in the still water. He never saw them approach. Silas came from the front. Caleb circled behind. Eli entered, watching the man as though studying a future he already knew would end. The fisherman turned at the sound of a skiff lightly bumping a root. His spoon froze halfway to his mouth. "Eli?" he said, confused. "You gave me a scare. What are you doing way out here?" Eli didn't answer. The fisherman's eyes darted between the 3 men. He felt the wrongness in the air immediately. Slowly he raised his hands. "Now hold on," he said. "Ain't no reason for trouble. I ain't touched nothing of yours. And I sure as hell didn't touch that box." Silas took 1 step forward. The fisherman flinched. "Please, I got a family, Eli. I got 2 girls. Eli's voice came out flat. "Then they'll learn what happens when a man fishes where he shouldn't." The fisherman tried to stand, but Caleb was already behind him. A single shove sent him stumbling into the water. Silas climbed in after him. The fisherman kicked and splashed, screaming for help that wouldn't come. It didn't take long. When the water finally settled, Eli gazed at the spot where the fisherman had disappeared. "One more," he said. But the last fisherman had already heard something. A distant splash, a shout, a disturbance he couldn't place. He'd cut his motor and drifted into a thicket of trees, hiding his skiff beneath a cedar canopy. Every instinct screamed at him to stay quiet. He didn't know that Caleb could read silence like other men read tracks. The Duprees found the boat tucked into the shadows. The fisherman was crouched low, barely visible, holding a flare gun with trembling hands. When he saw the skiffs emerge from the trees, he fired. The flare burst overhead, a bright red streak cutting across the canopy. It didn't hit anyone. It only illuminated the Duprees, 5 silhouettes carved from swamp water and vengeance. The fisherman scrambled for the motor. It sputtered, choked, then roared to life. He tried to flee. For a moment it looked like he might escape. The skiff cut through the channel faster than any of the Dupree boats. He glanced back, hope sparking in his chest. Then his hull scraped a hidden stump. The boat jolted sideways. He flew into the water. By the time he surfaced, Jonah was already standing on the stump, rifle aimed at the sky. Not at the man, but as a signal. Silas and Levi plunged into the channel, cutting off both sides. Caleb blocked the deeper water. Eli drifted in front, unhurried, as if the bayou itself pushed him toward the man. The fishermen begged, screamed, prayed. But the Duprees didn't waver. It was over in minutes. The water calmed once more. 18 men dead. The bayou returned to its stillness, its heat, its deceptive peace. As the Duprees tied the last anchor and watched the final set of ripples fade, Eli closed the broken cedar lid and whispered, "Balance." Then they turned their boats home. No celebration, no regret, just the quiet acceptance of a debt repaid.